Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. For this session of Searching and Researching, I want to invite you into the creative lab of a cutting room of a work in progress, a new multi-screen installation, working title, Chambers of the Heart. In order to shine a light on some creative tensions in image and ideas formation that shape and flow through the process of making, my thanks here to Professor David Chung of the Stamp School of Art at the University of Michigan, where we have an institutional relationship shaped by Professor Oriana Badley. And also my thanks to researcher Iris Wakulenko. Together we are co-developing this project that we're about to have a window into. For 30 years in my own documentary practice, I sought to develop what I think about as intercultural documentary, an approach that insists on making visible the beautiful pluralism of Britain's truer and deeper reflection of itself and our histories. That shift was essential for my generation at a time when a single monoculture dominated television, public art spaces, most state institutions, and public life, spaces where the Windrush generations were invisible. And it's a privilege here to share the panel and the day with such significant voices in the making of pluralism in contemporary British culture. But the theme I investigate now is how to hold that exploration of difference in a period, hopefully not an age, but a period of disinformation and separation. Most storytelling across arts and media has a very big challenge today. Now, far too much of our mixed media landscape can be characterized by what Peter Coleman describes as toxic polarization. Whilst liberal democracies largely ignore these threats with a reflex defense of free speech, they are less practiced in reflecting on and counteracting the insidious effects of speech untethered from a central connecting vision of the tender and the delicate relationships of care that grow a collective culture. Key production processes and algorithms feed this polarizing trend, magnifying the attitudes that lean towards conflict. The profits of online vitriol are great and underpinned by an income generation model that rewards a lucrative and undertaxed trade in the heat and friction of polarization, catalyzing disaffection and driving people to extremist content. In much social media, the division is amplified. But today, there are fewer bridges between ideas and opinions, a trend that hollows out the quality or sometimes even the prospect of dialogue in the public sphere and threatens to denature the connective tissue that forms the habitus of UK multiculture. In making the case for more relational storytelling, it's important to protect the essential work of robust and rigorous reporting and its significance, for example, in exposing crime, corruption, and holding officials to account. The argument here is not about so-called objectivity or the inevitable black and white aspects of the Fourth Estate. Rather, I'm trying to respond to the reflex polarization of so much media culture by researching relational ways of storytelling that can create restorative narratives. Reflections on documentary making led me to argue for a new focus on the centrality of ethics in practice, especially when recording lived experience. Without a clear ethical frame and an internal compass, too much of our media risks further damaging the situations it purports to describe, leaving yet more polarized trails for audiences to choose between. The way that practitioners rehearse these exploitative patterns begs uncomfortable and necessary ethical questions for many creative practices and their funders. Over the last 3-4 years, here are some of the things that the university, I've been producing, but with UAL. So asking questions about the nature of dialogue, what are the conditions for dialogue. This has an argument for what I'm about to show you is an example of an attempt towards restorative narrative. And then some reflections on the ethics for practitioners and institutions about how we go about storytelling. And then one resource the university has invested in, this website which explores some of the underpinning dynamics about how we work with another So I'm mentioning all that if anyone wants to follow these things up, that's all available, or we can give you further links and copies of that material. Okay, so I'm about to make an argument for an experiment in bringing together film and media practices to rethink the art and information architecture for more relational storytelling, socially designed to be biased enough to nurture the connective tissues between communities, drawing on practice methodologies from restorative justice, including deep listening and searching for shades of grey. In finding stories that can model this, I continue to benefit from the nuanced research and clear analysis of writer and founder of the Forgiveness Project, Marina Cantacuzino, and the educational work that the charity does. Her careful unpicking of the shifting countercurrents of emotion, inspiration, and pain involved in understanding the motivations of victims and perpetrators gave me some confidence to try to learn to be with the two men you're about to meet and to attend to what a more visual exploration of the connection might mean. So what I'm about to show includes test footage, as Oriana signaled, from the beginnings of a work in the delicate process of becoming. Much more will be shot in the coming year, so these are glimpses of unresolved and emerging ideas. Technically, the sound is raw, the images are sometimes placeholders, the footage ungraded, and what you'll see is likely to appear on 3 separate screens or projections in an installation, rather than 3 images on the same screen that you'll see here. So please approach it with that in mind. I should say, actually, when I'm working with some of our wonderful students, I say be very careful who you let into the cutting room. So we're among friends. So could we just run the first 10 seconds? What happened here in the Milwaukee suburb of Oak Creek in August 2012 is an event so shocking that its ricochet is still felt even in the heavy lineage of race-based mass murders led by white supremacy in the United States. I heard about a man living here called Pratap Kaleka, son of the Sikh temple president Satwant Singh Kaleka, one of 6 people murdered in the Milwaukee Gurudwara or Sikh temple shooting. Pradip's response to me made it clear that revisiting his experience of the shooting would not risk re-traumatizing him. He wanted to share what happened. Quote, "I thought I was experiencing post-traumatic stress," he said, "but actually I'm now experiencing post-traumatic growth. I value each day more than someone who hasn't gone through this." And for me, when I heard that, I was thinking, what on earth could Pradip's journey have been to get to that realization?
Needed anything, and those were the first 2 people who were shot outside, and their final resting place was kind of over by that vehicle over there, that black vehicle. And then after those 2 people were shot, there was 2 children who ran inside and started to warn everybody. And as they ran inside, people started to find their own hiding spots. So the first shot that was ever fired inside the temple here was fired at that frame.
But what of the white supremacist side of this story? In my early work, I would not make room for extremist opinion or the bigoted people whose hatred has caused so much hurt, loss, and sometimes death. Later on, in many places, and with people facing conflict or its aftermath, however, I listened closely, engaging sharp arguments on different sides of an event, an idea, or a conflict. In South Africa, Rwanda, Aboriginal Australia, here in the UK, and in many other places, I put counter-arguments to each side in the search for understandings for diverse audiences. There were curious highlights of this process too, for me personally. For example, being schooled in the logic of grand apartheid by 3 generations of the Verwoerd family in their home on their white-only homeland of Orania. But I felt their presence was essential in a film about the future of the new South Africa. But I remained wary of giving space to known perpetrators unless in cross-examination, where scrutiny would emphasize their wrongdoing. For example, filming Gideon Nivut, the South African security policeman who applied for amnesty to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC of South Africa, for his role in the murder of Black consciousness leader Steve Biko. Nivut admitted hitting Biko with a cut-off rubber hose during interrogation in a police station in Port Elizabeth. After that, Biko suffered a slow and terrible death. I filmed Nivut's testimony, but did not, and in that situation could not connect with Nivut's human story. I then interviewed Steve Biko's oldest son, Nkosinati Biko, after he listened to Nivut's evidence. I gave Biko much more screen time to shape the story. In this, I was guided by Emmanuel Levinas. His challenge? To pay profound attention to the face of the other as a way of preventing subsuming another's being into what he cautioned could become a totalizing vision. Levinas insists that the gaze of the other is primary, leaving us the ethical duty of creating and realizing our relatedness. Here in Milwaukee, the other didn't appear in the form of a state critic or social justice campaigner or an atrocity survivor, but a former white supremacist, Arno Michaelis, a founding member of what was claimed to be the largest racist skinhead organization in the world, the organization responsible for the Milwaukee Temple shootings.
This tattoo here is my last remaining racist tattoo. It says Rahowa in Norse runes, which means racial holy war.
I had read about Arno Michaelis' violent history. I was horrified by the pleasure he took in so very, very many gratuitous and grievous violent attacks on very many people of color, gay people, Jewish people over the years. Alongside my own revulsion, I didn't know how far to push in exploring the histories of what he has done. By naming more of this, would an audience be too repelled to take in his story or even to listen to him again at all? Or might some celebrate his racist past? At the same time, do audiences have a right to know, and if so, how literal to be? Having found out as much as possible when faced with the real person, somehow letting the meeting and experience run through my body, an inner somatic awareness, is an important element in shaping a way of being in the act of looking, listening, and filming. As we increasingly know, the body keeps the score. The methodologies of nonviolent communication and mindful awareness have much to say about this in finding a response that integrates head and heart, anchored in somatic awareness. On a good day, the camera and my hands will find the frame that responds and know what to do or know how to guide others filming. This is always a heuristic experience for me, with discoveries and reconfiguration emerging from the liminal skin of the film, its makers and subjects. Leading me into this was Pratap Kaleka with his own therapeutic training, his experience as a policeman, and his inner knowledge of how to respond according to the Sikh teaching Chardikala, which means we move in relentless optimism. The temple shooter shot and killed himself after the murders. Pratap found the strength to be confident for his family and community, but later came to feel and know that he was performing a false self, appearing strong for others, but collapsing inside. Pratap needed to understand why the shooter did what he did, and thought Arno Michaelis might be the key. So he reached out to Arno after the mass shooting. Arno, for his part, some years after renouncing his extremism, knew that he bore some responsibility for the murders, having co-founded the organization that recruited disaffected white kids like the shooter. And here's an exchange about their first meeting.
I just remember that first question that you asked me of like, what happened to my eye? Caught me by surprise. And I was kind of, what did happen to my eye? As I started to go into the story, what happened to my eye, and I see you grimacing, and I see you feeling my pain.
Right.
I knew that at that point, our relationship started from a genuine place of empathy and understanding, care, and consideration. And as we sat down and we started to share about our fathers and our daughters and our, our struggles and our challenges and our hopes, at that point, you answered exactly what I needed you to answer at that point. Because there were so many people. The frustration of that time was when you went to different audiences and everybody, kind of put their hand down of, well, what is responsible for white supremacy in this country? What are we going to do about it? Is it about guns? Is it about, legislation? Is it about this thing or that thing? And as people put their hands down, you feel it's just sort of disillusioned.
Right.
And
so
when
not it.
Yeah, when you raised your hand and said, listen, you will not have to walk on this journey alone. I'm going to walk with you. And for you to step up. And I knew at that moment that I gained more than I could ever describe in words. And I think that's what the gift of this wound was.
Man. Thanks, man.
Now you're gonna squeeze my heck out of my hand.
Like as soon as I heard news of it, before it was revealed it was a white nationalist who had committed the attack, I just had this gut feeling that that's what it was about. And this gut feeling that like I had something to do with this before that was established by media. And I was not just shamed, like humiliated at my past behavior. And so I think definitely if we're thinking about the day-to-day work, and this seems like counterintuitive too, because my whole thing was like I can never forget the people that I've hurt. I can never forget the harm that I've done. I need to be accountable for it every single day, always. And then later on, and especially what you've taught me over the past decade, is like I can't be hating myself about it either. So it's this constant like balancing act of acknowledging that harm and being like dedicated to trying to reconcile it without like hating myself for doing those things. And it's always the people I have the hardest time finding compassion for are white nationalists. Like when ISIS was at its peak and the so-called Islamic State was committing some of the most atrocious acts that the world has seen in a broad scale in a long time. It's so easy to hate the people who did that, but it was easier for me to be like, well, I don't know what it's like to grow up in the Middle East with nothing, or to grow up in this oppressive regime, and I don't know, I've never walked in those shoes, and it wasn't like giving those guys a pass, but I had got to the point where it was relatively easy for me to be compassionate towards ISIS or towards like some kid from the inner city who does a drive-by shooting, or anytime stuff like that happens. I'd always be like, yeah, well, I never shot anybody, but for the most part, just driving around and being an asshole, like it's hard to beat me as a kid. I set a pretty high bar for that. And then when the shooting happened, and I would think about Wade Page. It was like my first response was just this bitter hatred for him, and I think that hate was driven by my shame, because I was so ashamed that I was part of that, and I was so ashamed of the harm that I had done that was still reverberating and is still reverberating to this day. And what I've learned since then, a lot from you, is that if I'm hating myself and if I'm having this grudge against myself, it's gonna just absolutely neuter my potency to do something about those things. If I would have been overcome by my self-hatred the day we met, that would have been the type of thing where, okay, I can't even do this.
What became clear to me was that my role was to step back as much as possible from interviewing and let Arno and Pradeep find and refine the story in conversation and through friendship. The texture of friendship would therefore lead the encounter and many of the movements and shot choices that followed. What emerged in this complex unraveling truth was that as both victim and perpetrator, each held an invisible key to the other's journey from survival to new life. And here's the last clip, it's very short.
And I think when I got to the temple and just saw all of the faces, that were just in a place of incredible pain, I knew that there was something that we all had to do. I just didn't know what.
Right.
And so some of the desperation really was, what do we do? How do we uplift this community?
In this last scene, the three separate but juxtaposed screens enable us to take a conversation and explore it as a dynamic happening, where shots and audio are not synchronous across the screen, but offer a way to reimagine and recreate a happening. I think of these forces as a kind of these forces of between victim and perpetrator as a kind of rhythm of the heart, producing systolic and diastolic pressure, attraction to the light of finding a way through loss, and revulsion at the hatreds and violence that have brought us to this place. I'm working with other practitioners like Dia Khan, Yuli Cohen, and Marina Cantacuzino to develop an educational resource aimed at supporting storytellers to develop listening and response skills that can help configure a space where the most challenging stories can be held, but be held in a way that dreams and invites connection. The show related to this is due to open in Detroit and Ann Arbor, and hopefully will be there in the run-up to the next US presidential election, and hopefully find a UK home too. An educational program developing alongside this work will host research debates using examples from Chambers of the Heart as a way of thinking about dialogue. To conclude, at a time when storytelling sees a drift toward yet more pointed and polarized antipathies of difference, this is a necessary time for audiences to explore our own heart chambers, like being curious to understand a perpetrator. I found that this work by turns threatens to topple my reflex certainties and dare to enter a place of not knowing and of imaginative identification where the process of filming finds its own haptic visuality, its inner logic of response, its location and place. Like new neural pathways, exposure to restorative stories can make it more possible to imagine better outcomes from those who walk a path of transforming unspeakable loss. If the medium can become the message, what if the process of creating that media is dedicated to restoring relationships through the light of understanding difference, committed to an avowedly restorative approach to storytelling? What new visions may then flow from these new narratives and the ethics of such a media practice?